Honeybees belong to one of the few species of social insects which are able to survive winter periods as a colony. The correct management of colonies can improve the bees' chances in this struggle for survival. Management of bee colonies by annual rotation. An effective way of preventing diseases. Management of bees by annual rotation shows how colonies can be managed so as to remain healthy and strong throughout the year. These stocks have been well fed in autumn and are still in their winter sleep. Modern hives can be left in the open. Good hive stands protect the hives from rising damp and against the chill from the ground. Occasionally, the beekeeper must check that entrance holes are not blocked by ice or debris. Here we can see an example of the good winter cluster of a healthy, strong colony. In early spring, a good supply of pollen is especially important for the rapid development of a colony of bees. Willows are a valuable source of nutritious pollen. Because the bees' range of flight is very limited during this chilly time of the year, such sources of early pollen should not be too far away from the apiary. When making a first examination in spring, check the food reserves, the state of the brood nest and the number of frames covered by bees. This colony fulfills all our expectations. Last year's care and management have paid off handsomely. The apiary is situated near some allotment gardens. They give hives a good shelter from cold winds and provide an abundance of nectar and pollen. Here we want to demonstrate a simplified form of spring inspection. After tilting the upper brood chamber, an inspection of the passages between the frames gives enough information on the stock's strength, its brood and food reserves. Other excellent sources of pollen and nectar are fruit blossom and dandelions. Surrounded by stimulating sources, these colonies have developed so well that the brood nest can be expanded. To start with, we remove the wax drawing frame already containing sealed drone brood. The comb in this Varroa bait frame is cut out. It is our first step in the fight against the dreaded mite. Because Varroa prefers to reproduce itself in sealed drone cells, the destruction of drone bait comb enables us to reduce the number of parasites considerably. The second wax drawing frame is also full of drone larvae, but none are sealed. It remains in the hive until our next inspection. Once more, we are able to assess colony strength as we tip up the upper brood box. As a next step, we remove the plastic foil which serves here as a crown board and replace it with a queen excluder. Then we give more room by adding a third brood box as a honey super. This new brood chamber has been filled in such a way that frames with drawn comb alternate with others with foundation. Such an arrangement of frames is important because it will provide us with many frames of drawn brood comb for the formation of new colonies at a later date. Furthermore, this way of giving room ensures that no sugary winter feed gets into the honey crop. The stock has now 3 stories and is well prepared for the forthcoming nectar flows. In many districts, it is the oilseed rape which provides the main crop of spring. Because of its rich pollen supply, the colonies can soon grow strong, and many show first signs of an inclination to swarm. This is, of course, just the right and natural moment for making increase. All colonies must now be examined regularly at 7 to 9 day intervals for swarming intentions and the need for more storage space. This is best done by tilting the upper brood box when swarm cells can be seen clearly after a quick glance into the gaps between the bottom bars of frames. Again, the Varroa bait combs of the wax drawing frames are cut out in order to reduce the growth of the populations of the parasite and provide the bees with the opportunity to build comb. Next, we examine the supers. This stock has drawn out the sheets of foundation, and the honeycombs are 2/3 full of honey. It is obvious that the colony requires more storage space. Burr comb is scraped off the top bars before the stock is given another honey super. In this second super, we repeat the arrangement of alternating drawn frames with others of foundation. All stocks are dealt with according to their strength and their need for more storage room. When climatic conditions are favorable in late spring, the robinia, also called false acacia, provides an important crop. These colonies have been brought back to the home apiary and are ready for the removal of the honey and for shook swarming, one way of making a colony increase. Scales, a swarm box, a funnel and a sprayer are required for this job. The weight of the empty swarm box is recorded first of all. Furthermore, we must have a spare floor, a crown board and an empty hive body at hand to take the frames of honey after all bees have been brushed off. The funnel must be sprayed with water before we open the first hive. This helps when shaking bees into the swarm box. When raising the upper brood box, it is best to puff smoke into the passages between the combs. This makes many young bees leave the brood nest and flee into the honey supers. Next, we lift off the supers and set them aside. This prevents young bees returning into the brood nest. Covering the hive reduces the danger of robbing. Here, the peak of a colony's development can be seen clearly, and bees and honey must be removed at once in order to avoid swarming. Shaken or brushed into the funnel, the bees fall into the swarm box underneath. Comb after comb is brushed free of bees until the shook swarm has reached the desired weight. As a rule, it is possible to take one shook swarm from each colony. Should colony strength be insufficient to give us full weight, then it is possible to add more bees from another colony. This colony was strong enough, and the mass of bees was enough to give us one shook swarm. Because the supers contain no frames of brood, this method makes certain that no drones, nor a queen, get into the shook swarm. The presence of drones would cause unnecessary unrest and could lead to overheating and the death of the bees through suffocation. The swarm boxes are covered with wire gauze on two sides in order to provide good ventilation. At this time of the year, the ideal weight of a shook swarm is around 2.5 pounds of bees. After thumping the swarm box firmly on the ground, the funnel is removed and the lid is put in its place. The queenless shook swarm is now taken to an airy, shaded place. Every colony is treated in this way. all shook swarms remain in the shade until they are ready to be taken away. The supers are now strapped together and are loaded onto a trailer. Finally, the swarm boxes with the shaken bees are put on the trailer. It is important that the swarm boxes have adequate ventilation during transport. Having reached the extracting shed, the shook swarms are unloaded first and are set down outside for their varroa treatment. The trailer with the honey is driven into the shed for extraction. Several chemicals have been officially approved for the control of varroa mites. Here we administer a systemically acting remedy. After all shook swarms have been treated, we turn our attention to the catching of the mated queens. First, the queen is clipped with fine scissors. 1/3 of one forewing is removed to prevent her from flying. She is then put into an introducing cage and this is closed firmly. After again thumping the swarm box firmly on the ground, the queen cage is suspended by wire among the bees. For the next 24 hours, the swarm boxes are taken to a cool room where they are put down on sheets of white paper for a simple assessment of the extent of varroa infestation. Because shook swarms are artificially created swarms and bees have an empty honey stomach, they must be given some food soon. Here they are fed with goods candy, made from honey and icing sugar, and the room is darkened. Once the shook swarms have been dealt with, we return to the out-apiary and attend to the control of swarming in the parent stocks and the putting on of supers. Checking for signs of imminent swarming is, again, done by looking into the passages between combs. Although a lot of bees of the adult population had been removed, colony strength is still sufficient to take advantage of any expected flows of nectar. The wax-drawing combs full of sealed, varroa-infested drone brood are cut out again. All other colonies are treated in the same way. Empty honey supers are put on last. At this time of the year, the supers are filled with drawn comb because bees tend to fill drawn cells more readily. The sequence of events, which has been shown here in two stages, first the removal of a shook swarm, followed by swarm control and adding supers, can also be completed in a single operation. After adding supers, the old colonies are ready again for the next crop. The various flowers of the forest or the avenues of lime trees are suitable crops of summer. They produce floral and honeydew honeys. Back to treatment of the shook swarms. After a one-day period of confinement, we remove the remnants of the candy from the shook swarms. On the paper underlays, we will find some debris and dead varroa and can evaluate the mite infestation of the shook swarms. The debris consists mainly of sugar crystals and wax scales, and the oval bodies of dead varroa can easily be distinguished. During the period of confinement, the bees have fused into a small colony, and their contented, quiet clustering shows this clearly. The shook swarms will be given new brood boxes. These should contain 1 to 2 combs with sealed honey, as well as frames of drawn comb, which have been removed from the parent stocks. For transport, the entrance holes are plugged with paper. Before hiving the shook swarms, the bees in the swarm boxes are sprayed with water. This prevents their flight. At the same time, we remove the caged queen. Now we dump the bees into the open space of the deep floorboard in which the front entrance has been closed with wire gauze. An inner floorboard is put on. This is followed by the prepared brood box. The queen cage is suspended between 2 frames, and the plastic foil and the roof are put on last of all. The bees remain in the dark room overnight. They need a little time to clean out the honey-moist combs. Experience has shown that when such package bees are left in confinement overnight, they are more harmonious and content. The following morning, these freshly established colonies are taken to their new apiary. This should have been chosen to assure an ample supply of nectar and pollen for all. Giving a puff of smoke, we remove the wire screens from the entrance. Only the small upper entrance above the deep floor is opened. This picture shows the calm, settled condition of the colony. The cage with the queen is removed and is returned after the wooden plug has been replaced with one of candy. After a few hours, the bees will have opened the passage to release the queen. This slow introduction facilitates her acceptance. After 1 week, it is best to check her acceptance. A comb is removed from the center of the hive. Here the queen has established a good, closely packed brood nest. All is well. Until now, the colony's requirement for food had been assured by the frames of honey. To stimulate development of the brood nest, it requires a constant stream of liquid food as well as a regular supply of pollen. When the outside sources are insufficient, small helpings of food in liquid or solid form must be given. It pays us handsomely to give regular feeds of sugar syrup until the first brood emerges. All signals are now set to clear the way for a healthy and rapid development of the new colonies. They are a young queen, new combs, many young bees, a steady stream of food and a good supply of pollen. Another way of forming new young colonies is making nuclei with combs of emerging brood. The adult bees, having been brought home about 9 days previously, are queenless, and the frames by now contain only sealed brood and stores of honey. A sufficient number of brood boxes with floors and roofs must be prepared in order to divide the large accumulation of bees and brood into nuclei. These brood chambers should contain frames in the following order: an empty drawn comb, then a pollen comb, next to a comb of honey. Then we leave a gap to take the brood combs. Beyond the gap there should be 2 more frames of drawn comb and a frame feeder filled with soft candy. Now we transfer some of the frames of brood with the bees, having removed, of course, any emergency queen cells on the frames. Nuclei are made of different strengths depending on the time of the year, the way we requeen the stocks, and their final utilization. When insufficient bees are available, other bees can be shaken into the box after the frames have been closed up. Finally, in this case, the nuclei are given a ripe queen cell each. All other nuclei are formed in the same way. The original collection of bees and brood frames has now shrunk to a small nucleus which also needs a queen. Next, we open the entrance holes and let the bees fly. If necessary, these nuclei can be treated with an approved varroicide. Around 4 weeks after their formation, the nuclei can be given more room, and second brood boxes have to be prepared in advance. They should contain 2 bait frames for drone comb, as well as frames of drawn comb removed from honey-producing colonies. These young colonies need more room when they have at least 8 frames of brood and are full of adult bees. Nuclei which have not reached this strength before the end of July should be left in single brood boxes. Where extra room is needed, 2 frames of sealed brood are removed from the brood nest and transferred into the new upper hive body. This brood should occupy the central space made available by the removal of the 2 varroa bait frames. After closing the gap in the lower brood chamber, the 2 bait frames are used to fill the empty space along the outer hive wall of the lower brood box. Burr comb is removed from the top bars of the frames. The new brood chamber is put on top. This completes our manipulations on this colony, and we deal with the other stocks in the same way. The new comb now encourages the queen to expand her brood nest into the second brood chamber. At this time of the year, any extension to the brood nest should be made with drawn frames rather than with foundation. Pollen-clogged combs can also be used. It is possible to judge colony strength and the need for expansion by the number of passages which are packed with bees and by the large patches of brood. When nectar flows become scarce and insufficient, it's important to continue giving a little extra food in order to stimulate brood rearing. The food can be given as soft candy or, as in this case, in the form of granulated blossom honey. Giving solid food ensures that bees take the food slowly and do not fill the combs too quickly. The surface of the honey is covered with paper in order to avoid bees getting covered with sticky honey. This quantity is sufficient for about 14 days. The colonies are weighed at the end of August. The weight indicates whether the stores will be sufficient for winter or if additional feeding is needed. In late autumn, any additional food should be given as concentrated sugar syrup so that it can be taken down rapidly, ripened and sealed. But let's return to the honey-producing colonies. They are now on the heather moors in order to secure a last crop. When conditions are right, the heather can be an excellent source of nectar and pollen. In order to secure a heather honey of low water content at this late time of the year, it's especially important that the space available for honey storage is restricted to suit the strength of the colony. A colony on the heather should have an abundance of foragers as well as many combs of brood. When the heather flow is over, the colonies are ready for the removal of the honey crop and their dissolution as individual colonies. In order to prevent robbing, the entrance holes are blocked up first. Before we begin to dissolve the old honey producers, we deal with the one colony which will stay on this site in order to absorb any combs of brood which we find in the other stocks. Any varroa mites left in the brood cells will be eliminated later after the last bees have emerged. At the same time, this colony will also absorb all flying bees left behind when our work is done. First, we make an assessment of the state of the colony and the amount of brood. At the same time, we look for the queen and cage her. Only combs with brood are left in the lower brood chamber. All other frames, empty or full of honey, are brushed free of bees and transferred into a spare hive body. Combs with brood from the upper brood chamber are transferred to the lower one. Here too all other frames are brushed free of bees and are removed. The queen cage is now suspended between two frames of brood in the lower hive body. Depending on the strain of bees and the nectar flows, the quantity of brood will vary from one stock to another. At this time of the year, most colonies have no brood at all. All work is done, for the time being, when the last bees have been brushed off the last honeycombs. All other stocks are now dissolved and the populations of bees are also turned into shook swarms. To begin with, we must cage the queens. Later, the cages will be transferred to the swarm boxes. After spraying the warm funnel with water, the bees are brushed off the combs containing honey. In the case of totally empty frames, the bees are shaken rather than brushed into the funnel. Bees which had found refuge in the space of the deep floor are also dumped into the funnel to join the others in the swarm box. In the end, the box is bounced hard on the ground and the funnel is exchanged for a crown board. Before the swarm boxes are removed from the site, any bees adhering to the outside are brushed off so that they can fly to join the colony which will remain at the site. That colony will stay here for a further 3 weeks if its reserves of food permit. After that, it will also be turned into a shook swarm. The shook swarms, mostly infected with varroa, are now taken to a dark room, treated overnight with a varroa side and fed with soft candy. After this period of rest, each shook swarm made of these old honey-producing colonies will be united with a young colony made in early summer. To replace the plastic foil over the top bars, a sheet of newspaper, pierced in several places, is used. Nibbling their way through the paper, the shaken bees will join the other bees slowly, and uniting two colonies is achieved peacefully. An empty brood box is now put on the top of the newspaper, and we spray water over the shook swarm to stop bees flying up. After the removal of the queen cage, the bees are shaken into the empty brood chamber and the hive is closed up. This annual or rotational rejuvenation of colonies strengthens each healthy young stock by uniting it with an old colony after this has been freed of varroa mites. The result is that all colonies are powerful and well prepared to withstand the ravages of winter. Over the following days, we removed the empty chambers and any remaining pieces of paper. Late in autumn, the inner floorboard is removed. This ensures that in winter the bees remain cool, stay tightly clustered, and are well ventilated from below. In order to keep an eye on the varroa populations, a varroa screen with a paper inlay is put into the deep floor space temporarily. Because the colonies are now free of brood, another varroa treatment can be administered at any time. This depends very much on the initial varroa infestation and the chances of reinfection from outside sources beyond our control. Two to 3 weeks afterwards, the varroa inlays are removed and the number of dead mites is evaluated. This gives us a good picture of the extent of the populations of the parasite. After this, the colonies are largely left alone for the rest of the winter. The annual rotation system in bee management produces strong, varroa-resistant and powerful stocks which are able to overwinter and utilize all available nectar sources for an optimum honey crop the following year. A queen excluder is inserted between the two brood chambers to prevent the queen from having access to the lower chamber. We now release the queen into the upper brood chamber. A further queen excluder keeps the queen out of the super. After 9 days, all brood remaining in the lower brood chamber is sealed. After setting the upper chamber with the queen aside, we remove one outside comb from the lower brood chamber and shake all adhering bees back into the hive. In the center of the hive body, a gap is created. This gap will take the queen rearing frame with the grafts. Any natural queen cells must be removed. Returning to the queen-right part of the nursing stock, we remove the queen. It is transferred to a nucleus. The 3-frame nucleus is formed from 2 frames of brood and 1 of food, together with all adhering bees. All other bees from the remaining frames are brushed into the nursing stock. Besides good food supply, overcrowding lots of bees into one hive body is the recipe for acceptance and for best nursing for our breeding material. So we have compressed the bees from several brood chambers into a single box. Surplus frames of brood are distributed among other colonies. A guard made from queen excluder material prevents other queens from gaining entrance. About 2 hours afterwards, the colony shows typical signs of queenlessness. This is the time to transfer the queen rearing frame with the grafts into the gap. Here the nurse bees provide the young larvae with large quantities of royal jelly. This phase of engorging is important for the full development of the growing queen larvae. Great care is needed when inspections are made to check acceptance and success. The queen cells are sealed 5 days after grafting. When using this method, the nursing stock will retain the sealed cells until they are ripe. The other 2 methods divide the tasks of acceptance and finishing between 2 different colonies. In order to use the swarm box method, we also begin by first selecting a strong, healthy colony. Into the swarm box, we shake young bees from 6 to 8 brood frames. Make sure that the queen remains in her colony. The bees should fill about 1/3 of the box. They are provided with 1 frame of pollen stores, 1 frame with water, and 1 unsealed frame of honey. Then the swarm box is covered and is left undisturbed. After a few hours, the bees deprived of their queen become restless. The batch of grafted cells can now be applied. The finishing of the cells is done by other strong colonies. Because we need many nurse bees, we raise frames with open brood into the super and leave a gap between them. That space we created in the brood chamber is filled with empty combs. "24 hours after grafting, 15 to 20 started cells are inserted into the gap between the brood. The cells remain in the finisher colony until they are ripe and require caging. Now the procedure in actual practice. The swarm box has a large screened floor which prevents the bees suffocating during confinement. Having moistened the sides of a funnel, we brush the young bees off several frames of brood. This creates a queenless and broodless shook swarm. After briefly thumping the swarm box hard on the ground, the frames with pollen, water and food are lowered carefully among the bees. The water frame is made by spraying water into an empty comb. A special crown board which can hold the grafted cell cups is used. The swarm box is left in a cool, dark place until the bees begin to show signs of queenlessness. The crown board can hold between 50 and 60 cell holders. In order to avoid drying out of larvae, the grafting should be done just before they are needed. The bees will quickly supply the larvae with lots of royal jelly. Cut cells can readily replace grafted cell cups. The swarm box is now left alone for an hour at least. Once cells have been accepted, the finishing is done by another strong colony. In order to preserve warmth, we place an insulating cover over the swarm box. Rearing queen cells by using starter and finisher colonies also requires a healthy, strong stock. 9 days before starting, a queen excluder is placed between the two brood chambers to confine the queen to a single hive body. 9 days later, all brood in the lower chamber will be sealed. This part of the hive will become the starter colony designed to accept the cells. Removing 2 frames from the hive, we create 2 gaps. The other frames only contain sealed brood as well as some stores. We put the queen, with 2 frames of brood and 1 of food, as well as all adhering bees, into a nucleus box. This nucleus is taken to an out-apiary. We now proceed to cram all bees from the other hive bodies, on the right, into the one brood box which will be our starter colony. The brood frames, especially all frames with open brood, are later given to the honey chamber of other colonies in the apiary. The starter colony is now closed up. The entrance is covered with a queen excluder. Bees will shortly be gathering in the empty spaces. When bees show signs of queenlessness, 2 frames with about 40 grafted queen cells are transferred. The stock must be fed if the flows of nectar are scant. After 24 hours, the cells are transferred into occupied supers of honey-producing colonies, the finishers. It is important that several hours before, frames with open brood have been transferred into the honey chamber. Now a gap is formed. The cell-rearing frame with the started cells is placed in position. A finisher colony should never be given more than 15 to 20 cells. The starter colony can now receive 2 more cell-rearing frames. Here the first manipulations for raising queen cells by the starter and finisher method have been performed. The super and the upper brood chamber with the queen have been lifted off and are on the right. We remove 2 frames with only small patches of brood from the lower brood chamber. This creates 2 gaps. A starter should still contain at least 6 frames of sealed brood. If not, we must add frames of sealed brood from other colonies. Moving to the queen-right brood chamber, we remove the queen, together with 3 frames and the adhering bees, and put them into a nucleus box. All bees are brushed from the other frames, and the frames are temporarily placed into an empty hive body. Later, we transfer the frames into occupied supers of other stocks. The starter colony should be overflowing with bees, because this method too gives best results when we crowd many bees into the smallest possible space. After we have covered the hive, we place a guard of queen excluder material over the entrance. This stops queens from gaining access. A few hours later, in the queenless starter colony, we can hear the loud buzzing of the orphan bees. Meanwhile, young nurse bees have gathered in the 2 gaps. Now is the time for giving the starter stock about 40 grafted cells. Of course, the breeding material can also be offered as cut or punched cells. After 24 hours, the queen cells have been started by the starter colony and can be exchanged for another batch. Carefully, we remove the rearing frame and check for acceptance. Bees crowding thickly around the cells is a first positive sign of good acceptance. Bees are carefully brushed aside with a goose wing. Accepted cells can be distinguished by their lighter coloring and their greater length. Queen cups which have not been accepted are short and their opening has been narrowed. First, the 2 rearing frames are placed into a carrying box. Later, the started cells can be transferred into the care of a queen-right finisher colony. Lengthy delays should be avoided during transportation. 2 more rearing frames with fresh grafts are inserted into the gaps between frames. Because many young bees are emerging in the starter colony, we can use the stock for 6 to 8 batches at intervals of 24 hours. More batches are possible, but only if we constantly add more frames of sealed brood. Before queen cells are given to the finisher colony, they are checked once more. Each larva should swim in a generous supply of royal jelly. The task of finishing cells is done by any very strong and thriving colony. In order to make sure the larvae are supplied with the royal jelly which suits their age, the finisher colonies should have many nurse bees available in the supers. In order to lure the young bees into the supers, we remove at least 3 frames from the center of each super some hours beforehand. It is best if we leave frames with pollen and honey in place in order not to lose the impulse of nursing. But we remove empty honeycombs to create the necessary gaps. If all frames contain much honey, as can be seen in this case, even honeyed frames can be taken. During the following manipulations, we must make sure the queen cannot slip into the super. We select at least 2 frames with large patches of open brood. Here, many young bees are occupied in nursing the young larvae. The frames now are raised into the super together with all adhering bees, and we leave a gap of 1 frame between them. The gap created in the brood chamber is first filled with frames of empty comb before we replace the queen excluder and the super. We now transfer the cell rearing frame, with the started cells, into the gap between the brood. No finisher colony should receive more than 15 to 20 started cells, otherwise brood care will suffer. They remain in the finisher colony until shortly before emerging. Queen cells in the finisher are sealed on the 5th day after grafting. They have to be caged before emerging. This can be done on the 5th or 11th day after grafting, because then the cells are relatively robust, so that they can be handled. If we miss the 2 dates and 1 virgin is allowed to emerge, the whole batch of cells will be destroyed by the firstborn. Before caging, the nursery cages must be prepared. Waxen or plastic cups are filled with honey. Access to food is vitally important for the emerging queens, as they may well starve. The cups are fastened with honey into the base of the cages. This standard cage is secured by a movable plastic cover on one side and by gauze on the other. The cages are placed facing opposite sides alternately into a nursery frame. This arrangement is best where many queens are allowed to emerge in a colony. Many beekeepers have replaced the wooden cages with hair curler cages of 18 to 20 millimeter diameter. The cages are supplied with a reserve of honey by twisting the closed end of the cage in finely crystallized honey. The hair curlers are held in holes drilled into wooden blocks. But let us go back to the standard cages. With a gentle twist, we remove each cell holder from the cell bar and insert it into the cage. Shaking and rapid movement must be avoided at all costs during this operation. Furthermore, it is important to keep the cells upright at all times. The completed nursery frame with the cages is carefully set aside. Of course, when using hair curler cages, they are treated in the same manner. When virgin queens are allowed to emerge in the colony, the nursery frame is returned to the same place where the cell-rearing frame had been. Because sealed cells only need 50 to 70% air humidity and temperatures of 35 degrees Celsius, they can easily be transferred into an incubator for their last phase of development. Besides, in such an incubator, all work of checking emergence involves very little effort. The young queen bites through the tip of the cell and emerges 12 days after grafting. Lower temperatures may cause a delay in emergence, while raised temperatures can cause early emergence. A large thorax is a sign of good conditions during the queen's growth and development. From the time of emergence onward, the incubator should be checked at least twice a day. Conversely, on emergence in the colony, a daily check is sufficient. The cells should be removed after the young queens have left them, because sometimes a virgin will re-enter her own cell after emergence and is not able to leave it again. Marking queens is best done with numbered plastic discs, available from the appliance trade. For individual markings, they can be bought in various shapes and in annually changing colors. For applying the marking, the queen is held gently between thumb and index finger, with the thorax being uppermost. Using a pinhead, We apply a small amount of glue to the center of the thorax, making sure none is in contact with the roots of the wings. After moistening the other end of the marking tool, we pick up the plastic disc and place it over the glue on the thorax. Next, we let the queen run free over our hand, examining her carefully to see that she has well-developed legs and wings. Once marked for life, she can easily be found in a strong colony, and her age can be recognized by the color. Finally, we put her back into her cage until we require her again. No later than 2 days after emergence, we should introduce the young queens to the bees of the little nuclei from which they are allowed to mate. The bees needed for forming the mating nuclei are obtained by dissolving the nursing colony. They can also be collected from other strong stocks by shaking a few brood frames. Here the nursing colony is dissolved. At first we remove the nursery frame with great care and brush all bees off with a goose wing. The frame is put aside for the time being. One cage with a young queen is removed and attached to a piece of wire. The cage is hung into the special hive body, which is used to hold the shook swarm. All bees of each frame are brushed into a funnel over the swarm collecting box. If the queens are to be sent to an approved mating station, we must have no drones among the worker bees, as they could adversely affect the desired mating results. A drone excluder holds back the drones, while all the young bees run into the darkness of the swarm box. Once inside, they gather around the caged queen and form a cluster. The last bees still clinging to the sides of the hive are also brushed into the funnel. During these manipulations, many of the old workers fly away to their old hive stand, and the population of the shook swarmings overbrood are proof that the queen has mated and is producing worker brood. The bees of this mini-nuke have absconded and have abandoned the comb structure. This colony has lost its queen and has started queen cells. The domed cappings show that drones are being reared. Here, worker bees have started to lay several eggs into each cell. Only drones can develop from such eggs. Colonies with laying queens are returned to their owner as soon as possible. The entrance holes of the shelters are closed at once. The warden enters all observations, such as condition of colonies, start of egg-laying, or reasons for loss, into the record book of the mating station. The Queen's record card, which accompanies the Queen for life, is filled in and signed. Start of egg-laying, name of mating station, and parentage of drone parent colonies are entered. On arrival, the breeder quickly supplies the bees with some water. The condition of the bees is checked and the presence of the queen established. Queen-right nuclei are allowed to fly through the small hole of the entrance disc. Queen-less nukes are dissolved. Queens should not remain in the standard nuclei for too long, as the brood nest area is too small to keep them productive. When she is required for introduction, the queen is carefully removed from the little colony. For safety reasons, this work is best done in a closed room. The young queen is held in a cage without any worker bees. Introducing the queen via a shook swarm gives the best guarantee of acceptance. A shook swarm is easily formed by brushing the bees off several frames which are taken from strong colonies. The frames with bees may be removed from supers or from brood boxes. Under no circumstances should a queen be taken by mistake. In order to create a shook swarm strong enough to develop into a stock which is able to winter, the bees should weigh between 1.5 and 2 kilograms, depending on the time of the year. When enough bees have been collected, we thump the swarm box on the ground, quickly remove the funnel and put on the cover. A short while later, the swarm box is set on the ground once more. Now the caged queen is added without losing bees. Sugar syrup is fed later. Placed in a cool, dark position, the bees will form a genuine swarm cluster within the next 24 hours. Towards evening of the following day, the bees are hived just like a natural swarm. It is best to wet the bees with a spray of water. When working with multiple-story hives, the bees can be shaken into the deep underfloor cavity of the hive. A brood box is added containing either frames with comb or foundation. A feeder with sugar syrup is placed on top to provide food for the next few days. The queen is now transferred into an introducing cage in which the open end has been closed with candy. The hive is closed up and remains undisturbed for several days. A check to see that the colony is queen-right is made after 9 days at the earliest. Here we can see that the young queen has been accepted and has laid out a large brood nest. The first brood is already sealed and shows a good worker pattern throughout. This concludes the operations of queen rearing. By using queens of good pedigree, the colonies are rejuvenated and the genetic material is improved. Selective breeding is therefore essential to good apiary management. Rearing of queen bees. For many years, the rearing of queen bees has occupied a key place in beekeeping. Not only the beekeeping institutes, but also many smaller beekeepers dedicate much of their work and time to this important task. Queen rearing can only be done successfully during the short period of the year when the beekeeping season reaches its peak of activity. Young queens of good origin and character are needed to form new colonies and fill winter losses. The breeding material for rearing good queens, the youngest day-old larvae, are obtained from a breeder colony. Not every beekeeper has a worthy breeder queen, but he can obtain breeding material from a beekeeping institute or from established bee breeders. The breeder colony must possess certain characteristics. It should be disinclined to swarm and have an above-average honey production potential. The bees should be gentle and not display running and bunching behavior during an inspection and show resistance to disease and parasites. The genetic endowment of the queen will therefore essentially determine the characters and quality of the progeny. The most important criterion for selection must be an above-average productivity of honey, as this factor determines the profitability of a beekeeping enterprise. The nursing colony, on the other hand, must be able to raise good queens from the breeding material introduced. It exerts no influence over the genetic character of the queen larvae it is made to foster. The nursing colony must be healthy, prolific and strong. Many bees crammed together in the smallest possible hive space is the recipe for good results when raising queens. In order to achieve the conditions, the nursing colony should have access to good pollen sources during the previous summer. When spring comes, a stimulating honey solution must be fed whenever outside nectar sources fail. All work involved must follow a timetable corresponding to the development cycle of queen bees. For grafting, the breeding material should be not older than 1.5 days. Only by divided brood care can the transfer of the started cells into another stock be effected after 24 hours. Cells are caged on the 6th or 12th day. On the 13th day, queens emerge from their cells. On the following day, mating nuclei must be formed. 3 days after that, at the earliest, mating nuclei can be sent to their mating apiaries. For precise planning, a strip with these fixed intervals for actions can be aligned with a corresponding calendar strip. Let us first turn to the work involved in preparing the breeding material. 4 or 5 days before our planned starting date for rearing queens, we remove a frame from the colony with the breeder queen. We replace it with a frame with pale comb, which had been used once only for rearing bees, and which is still moist with honey after extraction. This comb quickly attracts the queen, and the beekeeper obtains many larvae of the same age. The frame is marked with a coloured drawing pin. On the starting date, the marked comb will contain young larvae of the right age, 1 to 1.5 days old. Perfect queens can only be reared from such larvae. Here we can see the larvae literally swimming in brood food. We protect the comb from direct sunlight and against drying by wrapping it in a moistened cloth. There are many methods of preparing the breeding material for introduction to the nursing colony. One of the more simple methods is the cutting of cells. With a knife dipped in hot water, an area of comb containing larvae of suitable age is cut from the frame. On one side of the comb, all cells are shortened by 1/3 of their length. This allows bees to enlarge the mouth of the cells and draw them out as queen cells. After this, the comb is divided first into cell strips and then into pieces of comb containing individual cells. The long reverse of the cells is nipped between the halves of a split cell holder. While the method of cutting cells makes wasteful use of precious breeding material, the grafting of larvae makes more economic use of the larvae. For this method we need artificially produced cell cups. These we can easily make ourselves from beeswax. By dipping a cell mandrel of 9 mm size several times into a wax bath, held at a temperature of 65 to 70 degrees Celsius, a queen cell cup is formed at its tip. After cooling in water, the cell cup can be removed. The artificial cell cups are attached to cell holders by means of more wax, which is melted with a soldering iron. The appliance trade also offers a number of cell cups formed from plastic. The cell holders are usually attached to a cell bar by means of melted wax. We require good light, good eyesight, and a steady hand when we are grafting larvae. The young larvae are taken from their cells with a grafting tool, which is slipped under the center of the larva from the back, lifting it and transferring it. There are several methods of raising queen cells. Here we will show you the use of 3 well-known methods. For raising queen cells in a queenless colony, we need a healthy and strong colony as our nursing stock, provided with ample brood as well as nutrient. 9 days before starting, we place an additional queen excluder between the 2 stories and confine the queen to 1 hive body. 9 days later, at the start of breeding, all brood in the queenless part of the hive will be sealed. After the removal of the super and of the queen-right part, in the center of the hive chamber with the sealed brood, a gap is created. Next, we form a 3-frame nucleus consisting of the old queen, 2 combs of brood, together with the adhering bees, and fill the space with a frame of stores. This nucleus is taken to an out-apiary. Into the queenless part of the colony, we brush or shake all bees from the queen-right brood chamber and also the bees out of the honey super. The nursing colony is then covered. A queen excluder at the entrance prevents strange virgin queens from entering. Bees begin to assemble in the gap. We transfer the cell-rearing frame with 20 to 30 cells into it after the colony shows the typical behavior of queenlessness. Whenever the natural flows are lacking, honey solution must be fed. The operations of this method are now shown on the stand. The nursing stock is prepared 9 days before starting. First, we find the queen and hold her temporarily in a cage. Combs with open and recently capped brood, as well as combs with pollen and honey reserves, are transferred into the lower brood chamber. The upper brood chamber holds empty combs and emerging brood. To determine the age of the drones at any time, color marking immediately after hatching has proved to be a very useful procedure. The drones can then forage freely until needed. 6 days, the queen is sexually mature. On the day before insemination, the queen is caged so that she can be later narcotized with CO2 in the laboratory. This treatment takes about 5 minutes, and it helps to accelerate the onset of egg laying. Until she is inseminated, the queen is returned to her nuclear colony. Hygiene is essential in the insemination laboratory. All glass and metallic instruments are autoclaved daily. In preparation for semen collection, a semen diluent, for example saline solution or, as here, tris buffer, is drawn up. The liquid is sterilized by microfiltration. The pore diameter of the membrane is 0.2 microns. Now the insemination syringe is filled with the buffer solution. Bubbles of air are carefully removed. The syringe is assembled and the column of liquid advanced to the front, save for a small bubble of air at the tip of the glass tube. Then the syringe is mounted on the insemination apparatus. Drones which have been reared in cages by workers are used as semen donors. Rolling and pressure on the thorax and abdomen effect the first phase of eversion of the copulative organ. Further pressure results in complete eversion and ejaculation. Mature sperm is cream-colored and marbled in appearance. As here, it often covers the white mucus plug of the endophallus. Using the glass tip of the insemination syringe, merely touch the surface of the semen covering. In aspirating the sperm, none of the mucus should be allowed to penetrate into the syringe, thus preventing the canule from becoming obstructed by a mucus plug. Similar to the natural mating process, the semen of several drones is aspirated in portions. A minimum of 8 microliters are required for insemination. This corresponds to the quantity of semen donated by 8 to 10 mature drones. If necessary, the tip of the canule is cleaned off with a sterile swab. A drop of diluent closes the capillary to prevent the semen from desiccation. Now the syringe is ready for insemination. The term sperm homogenization implies that the semen of, say, several hundred drones is blended to increase genetic diversity. To do this, the sperm content of several capillaries is diluted with tris buffer solution in a proportion of 12 to 1. Every operation must be carried out under ultra-clean conditions, because a single contaminated portion would adulterate the entire batch of semen and endanger all the queens of an insemination series. Because of the high effort involved, this technique should only be applied to large-scale breeding programs. A pipette is used to mix the suspension thoroughly and fill it into a special centrifuging tube. Any rotary centrifuge is suitable for centrifugation. After a 10 to 15 minute run at 1000 G, the sperm are deposited at the lower end of the tube. The clear supernatant is removed and the plastic tube is cut off on a level with the surface of the sperm. The insemination syringe is then filled with the homogenized semen. A queen who was treated with CO2 on the previous day is placed headfirst into the retaining tube. Then the queen holder is fixed to the block on the instrument. A whiff of CO2 helps to immobilize the queen. To control the dose of gas, it flows through a washing flask. The ventral hook, left, engages behind the ventral plate of the last segment. The dorsal, or sting hook, in this case a perforated hook, exposes the sting chamber. The sting lancets and epidermal folds are now visible. The vaginal orifice is recognizable as a wrinkled bulge in the middle. The syringe is adjusted in the direction of the vaginal bulge and the droplet of diluent removed. The vaginal orifice is only exposed in techniques which lift up the sting apparatus. The syringe can therefore be inserted without the use of a vaginal probe, and the semen is injected directly. This concludes the insemination procedure. The syringe and the hooks are removed. The still narcotized queen is released from the holder. Clipping one wing prevents her swarming later on, but it is nonetheless essential to cover the entrance of the mating cage with an excluder as well. Bee candy seals the cage and the queen is returned to her hive. The more favorable the brooding and temperature conditions are for the queen, the sooner she will begin to lay eggs.